Welcome, everybody, to this Burton K. Wheeler lecture. I'm Bradley Snow. I'm the chairman of the Burton K. Wheeler Center Board. We're very excited to be doing a lecture here tonight. Sorry about the weather, but thanks for coming out despite the inclement conditions. It's my pleasure to have my father here speaking to you all tonight on an issue that is unfortunately more timely than I think we want it to be. We're going to the Wheeler Center, as many of you know, is a public policy center that focuses on Montana issues. We're the only such center in the state of Montana. We've been doing our work, public lectures and conferences and economic roundtables and other types of programming for over 20 years now. And we look forward to hopefully a long future in the state doing this kind of work. We will be doing a conference in late March or early April. We don't have the date worked out yet, but it'll be on campaign finance issues. That conference will be in Helena. Watch our website, stay tuned for the exact date and location of that conference. And we should be getting that up on the website probably within the next few weeks. So stay tuned for that. That'll be in the spring. Without further ado, I'm going to hand the microphone over to our new executive director, Dr. Eric Austin.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. So how did we do in terms of timing? I can't imagine in my wildest imagination having picked a better topic and having accomplished with better timing for having this as my kickoff is sort of the public event that begins my tenure as the executive director at the Wheeler Center. I'm really, really excited to be here this evening. I'm really glad so many of you were able to come out this evening and join us. I wish I could take more credit for the timing of the event. I wish it were mine. This is actually, much of this happened before my tenure here with the Wheeler Center. I started in July, but this is an event that we started planning for much earlier than that. And sort of on that note, I need to say some thank yous and some acknowledgments before we start the sort of content of our program this evening. Along those lines, I want to start by thanking the board of directors for the Wheeler Center who really initiated the planning for this event this evening. Got this rolling, and as much as I would love to take credit for it, it is really the board members, some of whom are in front of you this evening. Bob Brown will be joining us here in a moment to talk a little bit more about our speaker, but it's the board largely that got this up and running this evening. I have a couple of other thank yous that I need to say, or a couple of other acknowledgments as well. We're joined this evening by, I saw him a moment ago, David Single from the Office of the Provost and Academic Affairs from Montana State University. Montana State University has been a longtime partner of the Wheeler Center. We are rebuilding and building new relationships with the university and are really enthusiastic about those opportunities. We're also joined this evening by Dr. Nicole Ray, who is the Dean of Letters and Science here at the university, which is my home department here at my home college at the university. Dr. Linda Young, who's a little bit further back, is my department head. Both Linda and Nicole have been instrumental in providing a great deal of support as I've gotten started at the Wheeler Center, and are looking at a lot of opportunities to build new programs, new projects, and to really strengthen the relationship between the center and the university. Let's see, also joined this evening by Carmen McSpadden, see if I can trip over that a little bit more, from the Leadership Institute. She has been invaluable, has brought a number of students this evening that have helped with sort of house management and have been ushers for us. Lots of connections between the work that the Wheeler Center does and the Leadership Institute. We'll be continuing to work along those lines here as we move forward as well. In terms of actually pulling the evening off, I absolutely have to thank the 3 Wheeler Fellows that have done sort of the yeoman's work associated with the logistics for the evening's program. They are way back in the back, but Kia Abbey, Lawson Norman, and Shay Sick have been really critically instrumental in doing a lot of the advertising, helping me with the logistics, and so thank you to them. We have a brand new administrative assistant who we threw to the fire, starting out in the last couple of days, but has been helping out with this process as well. Samantha Becker's been really useful here and very helpful also. Brad mentioned a minute ago, we have an upcoming conference this spring that will be in Helena, late March, early April. Stay tuned for that. We are also working to do some additional lecture events, and those are sort of brewing in development. And so I'm just going to kind of you to look back to our website. I can tell you they are going to be very exciting, but I can't tell you anything more than that. So check back to the website. We also have a sort of reactivated Facebook page. If you are on Facebook, please like us. If you have a Facebook page, check that out. We'll be pushing information out that way as well. Let's see. Let me say one word about the format this evening, and then I will turn the mic over to Bob Brown. Dr. Snow will be speaking for a while. We'll let him decide how long he wants to go. And then we'll do some question and answer afterwards. Some of you have probably noticed, we are capturing the video for this evening's event as well as the audio. We will be posting this. Actually, the first thing that will happen with that is that it will be broadcast through TVMT, through the PBS station that broadcasts the legislative sessions. As soon as we know when that's going to happen, we'll post that information as well. But the more important attribute or the more important aspect of that is that the only way we will catch your questions is if you have a microphone in your hand. So when we get to the Q&A, raise your hand, we'll get this microphone to you, that way we can capture that audio, so just be aware of that. We'll have lots of time for Q&A a little bit later in the evening. So having said all of that, I'm going to get myself out of the way here, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to a fixture of Montana politics, Bob Brown.
Well, thank you. You know, I spent 4 years here, 43 years ago. And when you come back to the place where you went to college, got all these wonderful memories, and you're always reminded of when you're here. This is kind of a cold, snowy day, of course. It reminded me of an experience that I had here probably 42 years ago, or 44 years ago. I lost my pants betting on the football team. And it was between the Cats and the Grizzlies. And the loser had to give his pants to the winner on the 50-yard line of the football. Can you imagine making a bet like that? It was a competitive game, but anyway, they beat us by something like 2 or 3 points. I think they beat us with a field goal. And it runs vaguely in my mind that we had missed a field goal earlier in the game, kicked by Jan Stinner, who went on to professional football playing, you know, but he sure let me down that. Anyway, I know I've been going over this afternoon, we've got experience, but it's all part of the great college experience that I did have here. Well, it's a pleasure to, as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Wheeler Center now, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to come back here again. And I'll be able to do it, I think, more often now, or at least I hope to be able to, in the months and years to come. And it's certainly a pleasure this evening to welcome you to the 2013 Wheeler Lecture. For those of you who don't know who Burton K. Wheeler was, there's a book that was written some years ago. It's an excellent book called Yankee from the West that tells you about him. And we've had some distinguished U.S. senators in Montana history, but I don't think we've ever had any more courageous than Burton K. Wheeler. And the fact that his center is located here on this campus is a wonderful thing for Montana State University, and I'm pleased to be associated with it. And our speaker this evening, former Secretary of the Treasury, John Snow, this is unique, I know, in the Wheeler Lecture Series, is the grandson-in-law of Burton K. Wheeler. He married Burton K. Wheeler's granddaughter. And the guy you just heard a couple of speakers ago, Bradley Snow, is his son, who would be Wheeler's great-grandson. So, right here in the same room on the same night, what an interesting coincidence, connected directly to Burton K. Wheeler. John Snow, He's an accomplished economist, an academic, a CEO. He was born in Toledo, Ohio. He was the 73rd Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, and he's an influential figure in the United States as well as in the global community. During his tenure as Secretary of the Treasury from February 2003 until June of 2006, under President George W. Bush, the Honorable John Snow led the Bush administration's economic team and was its guiding voice on domestic and global economic issues. He steered the effort to pass the historic 2003 Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Act, a signature achievement which significantly lowered tax rates on individuals as well as on capital investment, leading to a strong economic recovery enjoyed during that period. Prior to becoming Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Snow held the position of Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Global Transportation Company, CSX Corporation, for more than a decade. He also held several high-ranking positions in the Department of Transportation during the Ford administration, where he led the efforts to deregulate the motor carrier, airline, barge, and rail industries. Secretary Snow did his undergraduate work at Kenyon College and the University of Toledo, receiving his Bachelor of Arts degree in 1962. He went on to earn a PhD in economics from the University of Virginia, as well as a law degree from George Washington University. He serves on the boards currently of Marathon Petroleum Corporation, Vendor Processing Services Incorporated, Amada Hoffler Properties Incorporated, and the International Consolidated Airlines Group. So he remains very much involved, highly respected. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Secretary of the Treasury, John Snow.
Samantha's turning me on here. Bob, thanks for that great introduction. I feel very comfortable here for a number of reasons. Some of the ones, some of which are the ones you mentioned. You know, being back in the classroom. When Bradley was a little boy, I had to get up at about 6:30 or 7 o'clock to go out to the University of Maryland for an 8 o'clock course in Introductory Economics, the Foundations of Economics, or some title like that. And it was an auditorium like this. It had 500 students in it. And I was 24, 25 years old, and I was petrified that I'd fall flat on my face, and that the students would decide there's no point in going to those lectures. We'll just put a tape recorder at the front of the room, and there'd be 499 empty seats, one student with a tape recorder. Well, it happened to some of my other colleagues, so I was on notice. So I decided I wouldn't use notes. I would just learn how to reach out to the audience and talk to them like you did. I can see you're an accomplished speaker. And that has some bearing, because years later, when I was in the Oval Office with the President, about to be introduced to the American people as President Bush's nominee to be the 73rd Secretary of the Treasury, he looked at me and said, "John, the staff here in the White House is delighted that you're coming on board." And I said, "Well, thanks, Mr. President. I'm really honored and delighted to do it." He said, "Well, I'm really serious." He said, "You're a good communicator." He said, "That's so important, and we need that." And he said, "They tell me you often give speeches extemporaneously." Yes, President Bush used that complicated word. "And you even talk without notes. You don't use notes." And I said, "Well, coming back to the University of Maryland," I told him the story, and he said, "Boy, that is really, really something. I admire that." He said, "That's a great, great gift." He said, "In this job," and he looked at me very sternly, said, "Use notes." I thought if I ever wrote an autobiography, and for the Treasury Secretary, that was awfully good advice, because you're dealing with these global markets, these massive global markets. You're dealing with issues like the ones we'll come to in a moment, the debt ceiling and the budget crisis and the shutdown, and you deal with those issues, and one of the most sensitive is the question of foreign exchange. There's something like $5 trillion a day traded in the foreign exchange markets. And if the Treasury Secretary, who's the only person allowed in the United States government to talk about the dollar, ever slips and says the wrong thing on the dollar, the markets go into perturbation, wide swings. And the analysts love it, the traders love it, because they make money on these wide swings. So they're always trying to get the financial press to ask the Treasury Secretary a question such as, Mr. Secretary, how's the dollar doing? And of course, you learn how to dodge that question. It's the first week in office, you say to yourself, I'm going to learn the lexicon of this, I'm going to learn how to parry this question. And you come up sounding pretty idiotic sometimes, I must say, because you say, you know my policy, I'm for a strong dollar. And they press you further, and you say, there's no change in my policy, it's a strong dollar, it was a strong dollar the day I came in, it's a strong dollar today. Well, is the dollar strong? You know my policy. So you back and forth with all that, but Treasury secretaries learn to avoid that engagement. They don't want to engage on that question. Typified by the story of a very able Treasury Secretary some years back, who was invited to address a group, a small group, private group, after dinner. And he rose and accepted the chairman's request to speak, but the end of his presentation, a question came. Somebody raised their hand and said that the chairman would the Treasury Secretary take some questions? And the first question had to do with, how's your dollar policy doing? Just as you would expect. And the Treasury Secretary looked at the chairman sternly, and he said, Mr. Chairman, are there any members of the media at this dinner here tonight? And he was assured there were none. Then he said, am I assured by you that this conversation is privileged and it's a private, confidential conversation? And he was assured it was. And then he said to the chairman, Mr. Chairman, can you give me your word that this dinner is off the record? And he was assured it was off the record. The Treasury Secretary then went over to the person who had asked the question, who was sitting right where you are, and he said, no comment. So it really is fun for me to be back here. I feel at home, not only because it's a classroom university setting, but because there's so many family and friends that are in this audience, and of course the opportunity to honor somebody that I knew well and respected deeply, Burton K. Wheeler. And Bradley, I'm proud of you in this important role as the chairman of the Wheeler Center, carrying on the legacy of that needs to be understood. I think Senator Wheeler would be appalled at what's going on in Washington today. The failure of political leaders to grab the bit and act. The failure of political leaders to think beyond their own short-term political interests and put the country's agenda at the top of what they focused on. But it's also fun to be with so many Wheelers. Kendall, Robin, Hillary, and friends like Corky and Vanessa here that we've gotten to know through Bradley over the years. And I don't know how you timed this so well, Bradley, but to have the government shutdown and the impending default on the national debt be at the center of the national agenda at the very time I'm supposed to be here and talk about it. Pretty hard work to get that done. Now, as you pointed out, Bob, I've been in the Ford administration. And, you know, politics is never a beanball. It's always some strife and conflict to it. But I'll tell you, it's nothing like what I found when I went back to Washington. One of the jobs of the Treasury Secretary is to be on the front line for the issues like the debt ceiling, issues like the annual funding of the budget. And one of the jobs the Treasury Secretary has is presenting the President's budget, the administration's budget, to the Congress before the various congressional committees that have responsibility, the budget committees, the Ways and Means Committee, and the Senate Finance Committee, where a Montanan sits as the current chairman. And it fell to me to do that, but it fell to me to do that after I'd been in office a total of about 4 days. So I took the weekend and studied the budget documents for fiscal year 2004, because it's always the next year that you're defending the budget on. This was February of '03. And I worked hard and tried to master it and make the best case I could for the positions in the budget, tried to anticipate all the questions that would come, practice some good Q&A that you always do getting ready for these sessions with the congressional committees, recognizing there'd be some adverse questions. Not everybody loved the Bush administration budget. When you're in Washington and you're a Republican, it means about half the people are going to try and find a way to trip you up. Half the people in Washington get up every morning trying to trip up the other half, basically, how the place works. So I appear before the House Ways and Means Committee. Now, I've been in office 3 days. Make the case for the fiscal '04 budget. And got my introduction in the second questioner. The second questioner gave me this new introduction, their introduction to the new Washington. He looked at me sternly. And you're always sitting down, and they're always sitting up, so they have a certain advantage over you. Remember those days in the legislature when the witnesses are always down there? Oh, I should have said that we have in the audience a member of the Montana legislature, a member of the Montana House, who represents the 63rd district and who isn't only not only involved in public service, but I hope she's going to become a member of the Snow family. And I'm speaking, of course, about Bradley's betrothed, the Honorable Riley Neal. Riley, you better raise your hand so people know who I'm talking about. So the second or third questioner looks at me and he says, Mr. Secretary, you are presiding over a disaster. A disaster. He said, when you took office, we had a surplus. Now we have a deficit. He said, under your tenure, we've created 6 million unemployed Americans. Poverty levels are rising. The deficit is going to be in Reading as far as the eye can see. He said, this is a disaster. This is a disaster. You ought to be impeached. And I'm thinking, 3 days on the job? Give me a chance here. You know, maybe come back in 2 weeks and impeach me. But so I could have gone down Bradley on record as the shortest tenured secretary of the Treasury. Let's take a few minutes and talk about what's going on in Washington today. I know that's on everybody's mind, and maybe offer a perspective on it that goes beyond the headlines and puts it in context, in some context. I mean, these are all intelligent people. They're people who, by and large, do care about the country. And they're people who've been through elections. They represent somebody. And that's awfully important, because we are a divided country. The House of Representatives is almost evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans have a small plurality. The Senate is almost evenly divided. The Democrats have a small plurality. One thing I learned for sure about Washington is the members of Congress know their districts, they know their voters, they know what's on their voters' minds, and they are responsive to their voters. It's the rare congressman who says, I'm going to defy my voters and go there and just do what I think is right regardless of my voters. You know why there aren't very many of them? Because they'd never come back. They wouldn't last. They wouldn't be there. So I start with this proposition, we're a divided country. When you do these polls, the Gallup polls or the other polls, the focus groups, what do you find? The country as a whole is about 1/3 Republican, 1/3 Democrat, and 1/3 independent. And we're having an enormous debate about the future of the country. Do we want more government? Do we want government playing a larger role? Do we want a larger welfare state? Or do we want to shrink the welfare state? Do we want less government? Do we want smaller government? Less intrusion by government in our lives? That's the fundamental dividing line. And then you come to an issue that we're facing today, which is playing out that fundamental dichotomy in American political life. And I know the far right gets criticized and the far left gets criticized, and I don't have a brief for either one of them, frankly. But they are representing some voters. And they know if they go back to their districts and vote against the interests of those voters, they're going to be in trouble. So the situation we're observing and living with is in a way a natural product of the democratic processes, with one fillip that I think we'd have to add. That's gerrymandering. Over the course of the last 25 years or so, congressional districts, and both parties have done this when they controlled the state legislatures, have decided we're going to create a lot of safe districts. And it's the Republicans and it's Democrats. And so there are an awful lot of safe districts today. And the safe districts are really a lot different than the competitive districts. And the people who come out of the safe districts are a lot different than the people who come out of the competitive districts. When I was in the Treasury, I traveled around a lot across the country. Did a lot of speeches on the state of the economy and so on. And what I found was, because you always meet the congressman from the district always wants to come and be seen with you, because then they get on television. That's another thing congressmen like. They like being in the media. So you'd meet them. And the striking thing was the difference in the makeup, the temperament, the capacity of the members from the competitive districts versus the members from the safe districts. If you're from a safe district, you don't have to think much about the other side. You know, there isn't any other side that counts. If you're from a competitive district, you're trying to understand where everybody is coming from and then producing a result that brings people together. Those are the sort of politicians that D.K. Wheeler was. You know, there are three kinds of politicians, basically. There's the workhorse, that was D.K. There's the show horse, and then there's the furniture. The furniture are most of them who get moved around by the show horses and the workhorses. But the issue, remember Shakespeare's line about the fault lies not in the stars but with us? How do people get elected in the United States? Well, they promise the voters what the voters want, don't they? You know, more of this and more of that, more of what's good for you. Our district will do this. If you elect me, I'm going to make sure we have A, B, C, and D for you, my voters, my constituents. You're entitled to that. I'm going to go to Washington and get it for you. But they never say what it's going to cost. So our electoral process is based on telling the voters what they want to hear about the benefits that are going to come their way if you vote for me, but never telling them what it's going to cost, or only dealing with the costs in a deferred way. Then you ask yourself, why do we have a big deficit? Isn't that electoral equation I just laid out for you, isn't that a master plan for large deficits? If our elected officials get elected by telling us they're going to get us something and never telling us it's going to cost anything, they're going to get elected, they're going to go to Washington, they're going to try and produce that benefit, and they have. And the costs are deferred, but the costs are coming due. The costs are really coming due. And the issue that they're dealing with in Washington today is not the real issue. It's a sideshow on the real issue. What they're talking about in Washington today is the current budget. But the current budget is secondary. What we got to worry about is the long-term fiscal hole we built for the country. We're running deficits now. They've come down because of the sequester and some tax increases. The sequester was the trap that the Congress gave itself, hoisted by their own petard, and then they found that they put this thing out there so they wouldn't have to do it, and then they had to do it because they couldn't get out of its way. So now the deficit's coming down. The short-term deficit is 4 or 5%, headed towards that over the course of the next few years. Not too bad by historic standards. Still large in absolute terms, bigger than it should be, but all the commentators say, look at the deficit coming down. It's not really that big a deal, is it? Well, it's not in the short term, but go out 10 years and look at the CBO estimates. Congressional Budget Office, not Democrats, not Republicans. They're the professional budgeteers of our government. And what do they tell us? They tell us in 20 years, which isn't that far away, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security will absorb all of the revenues of the United States if we keep revenues at the 20% of GDP level that they've been historically. And that's pretty astonishing, isn't it? What that means is that our government will really be funding Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and won't have the revenues to fund Justice Department, the Defense Department, the Agricultural Department, NIH, and all these services. Now, how could that be? How could that possibly be? And how could it be ignored? Well, somebody once said that demography is destiny, and demography is driving the future fiscal affairs of this country. We're an aging society. We don't like to meet. Bill, you and I don't want to admit that, do we? But it's not just you and me, it's the country as a whole. And what happens with an aging society? Well, there are fewer workers. People are retired. Retired workers draw their Social Security. They live longer. Great thing, wonderful thing. But they draw their Social Security longer. When B.K. Wheeler was in the Senate, 1935, great idea came along, drawn from Bismarck. Let's protect people in their old age. Because people tend to overconsume in life and not, during their young years, the working years, and not save for the future. A perfectly reasonable proposition. And so we established Social Security. When Social Security was established in 1935, life expectancy for a male was 65. the workforce had something like 40 people paying in to Social Security. 40 people paying in for every one retiree. Over time, that number has just continuously come down. If you have 40 people paying in for every retiree, you'll have a healthy system. It'll work. But today it's 3. And in 10 years, it's going to be 2. Now, you can't have a fiscally sound Social Security system if 2 people, if there are only 2 people working to carry all these retirees. Now, this isn't a matter of ideology. This is not liberal, conservative, libertarian, or anything else. This is arithmetic. And you would think that you could deal with arithmetic and get sensible results. I remember Senator Moynihan, somebody I admire, a Democrat from New York, who was asked to chair the Social Security Commission back in 1983. Greenspan was on, and others of prominence. He opened the meeting by saying, delighted to have you all participate in this. Look forward to our work. He said, you're all going to be entitled to your own views, but you won't be entitled to your own facts. The fact is Social Security is not sustainable. But it's really easily fixable. The discrepancy between the revenues coming into Social Security and the expenditures, the amount going out, is pretty narrow. We could have fixed it. Tried to, actually, in 2005, and didn't get very far. That was pure politics. Because the other side had decided that this is a wonderful opportunity for us because they're trying to take away your Social Security. And the other side would never engage. So we didn't had one member from the other party in the House, not one member from the Senate, who would ever even engage on the issue. I learned a big lesson there. You got to have on big issues like Social Security. You need bipartisan support. If you don't have it, you're going to lose. And the Democrats actually had a big victory out of opposing Social Security. They took back the House in 2006. And part of their argument was, we saved your Social Security. Well, Social Security is fixable. We ought to get on with it. Bill Clinton wanted to do it in 96. In 96, I used to cite him all the time. He said, Social Security is on the verge of bankruptcy. 96. So 10 years later, I'm going around the country citing Bill Clinton. Republicans citing the Democratic president. And I would simply say, look, if it was on the verge of it 10 years ago, aren't we even that much closer now? Should we get around to deal with this? This is all about arithmetic. The arithmetic there is really very simple to fix. Everybody knows this in studying these issues. If you added something like 6 months to the retirement age for every decade going out, it's done. It's fixed. Not a big deal. Medicare is the gigantic deal. Medicare is mind-boggling. Because Medicare is this promise we've made to the citizens. Social Security is the promise for compensation in your retirement. Medicare is this sort of open-ended promise to health care. And what's happened to health care over the last 30 years? It's been going up at a compounded rate way beyond GDP. And you don't have to be Einstein to realize if something goes up faster than GDP long enough, what happens? It becomes GDP. And when Medicare was started, it was a small fraction of GDP. It's become a mighty big fraction. And as I say, in 20 years, Medicare with Social Security will absorb all of the revenues at the level that we have traditionally had tax policy in the United States. Now, how do you fix that? Well, I won't try to get into that tonight. That's hours and hours and hours of digging into a lot of complex facts. But Medicare is going up because we're an aging population, and you get older, you use more health care. And also, healthcare keeps rising, the cost of healthcare keeps rising. Again, way above GDP. So this combination of lots of new demand for the services, driving up the cost of services, and the services keep going up, and the current unfunded liability, this will give you a staggering number. If you looked at Medicare and you said, over a longer time horizon, 50-year time horizon, and you said, how far, on an actuarial basis, so an accountant of an actuary would look at it, how far out of killer is this system? Well, it's out, meaning the inflows and outflows, present value of the difference between inflows and outflows, the way an accountant would look at this, or an actuary would look at it, is something like $70 trillion. Now, the GDP in the United States is 16. This is 70 trillion. It's a huge multiple of the GDP of the country. How do we pay for things? We pay for things out of the GDP. So how do we fix these problems? Well, you say, let's cut discretionary programs. You know, don't we have remember Ronald Reagan talked about waste, fraud, and abuse? Let's just clean out all the waste, fraud, and abuse. That's how we'll fix it. Well, waste, fraud, and abuse isn't even a decimal point on Medicare. So that doesn't do it. Well, what about these discretionary programs? All these foreign offices we have, all these embassies, all these frivolous things, foreign aid. Let's cut that out. That isn't really good either. That's just peanuts against the increases in Medicare. Well, what about the other programs? Well, okay, tell me, you want to not have a Treasury Department? You want to not have a Defense Department? You not want to not have an Agriculture Department? And even if you take all of them away, you still can't solve the problem. Let's raise taxes. Well, that's an approach. We could raise taxes. Do you know how much you'd have to raise taxes to pay for this explosion of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security? Well, you'd have to more than double the current tax rate. So we go from 20% of revenue being absorbed by the tax system coming into to 40%. So okay, you're paying taxes at the rate of 25%. Now you pay 50%. Well, you say that what's so bad with that? Well, what do you think happens to an economy where tax rates are roughly doubled? It's not going to perform like the one we have today. One of the strongest teachings of economics is the simple lesson that you always get less of anything you tax. So if you put a lot of taxes on people, you're going to affect the way they behave. You're going to have less risk-taking. You're going to have less entrepreneurship. You're going to have less effort and energy put into the workforce. So we can't solve this by taxes. We wreck the economy. We can't solve it by cutting out waste, fraud, and abuse. It's just too small. We can't solve it by eliminating the discretionary programs because the mandatory programs are already 2/3 of the budget. They're just not big enough. Well, you're going to have to slow the growth of these programs, it looks like to me. And you're going to have to find a way to grow the economy so that the economy is robust enough to be able to help fund these this explosion. And you got to find a way to rein in healthcare costs. And that's part of the debate in Washington, how you rein in healthcare costs. John Rose, senator from wonderful guy, senator from New Orleans, really centrist politician. Never could have been beaten in Louisiana. Told me once at having dinner with him, he says, I'm just back from a town hall meeting. And he was telling me about his town hall meeting. And he told me about the lady who said to him, Senator, by gosh, whatever you do in Washington, this is at a time they were looking at some restraint on the budgets. I think back in the days of the Gingrich-Clinton budget settlement. Whatever you do on the budget, and I applaud you, you've got to reduce the size of government. Don't let those people in Washington get their hands on my Medicare. Well, of course, Medicare is entirely a government program. So the lady liked her Medicare and wanted to make sure it was preserved. And the truth is, people like Medicare. They like Social Security. They want them preserved. But if we preserve them in the form they are today, we're going to bankrupt the country. So I'll close on a hopeful note that comes from a great statesman with an American motive, Winston Churchill, who said about America, this is the optimistic note, said about America, we Americans always get it right. Always get it right. After they have exhausted every other possibility. So it seems to me we're well on the way to exhausting every other possibility. This will get fixed. I'm confident of that. I mean, this whole situation, because it has to. And what's going to fix it in the end is the financial market. Because the amount of debt that the United States will have to continue to issue to fund the annual shortfalls 10 years out is so large that interest rates on treasuries will skyrocket. And treasuries will face what's known as a failed auction. They'll put the bonds out there, the treasury bonds, which is the biggest bond market in the world, put them out there, and the Chinese and the Japanese and the Germans and the British won't show up unless interest rates are an awful lot higher. And if interest rates get to the level that they would have to get to enable us to sell our bonds, we're going to have interest at 10, 12% of the GDP. I've already told you that Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security are taking it to 20% of GDP. You add another 10% for the interest rates. It's just not sustainable. So that's my optimistic close. Borrows from a economist friend of mine from my days teaching at the University of Virginia. A guy named Herb Stein, who was a witty economist, if that's not an oxymoron. And what Herb Stein said is, if something isn't sustainable, this is wisdom here, if something isn't sustainable, it probably won't happen. Right? So this enormous growth in these programs that would bankrupt the country aren't sustainable. And since they aren't sustainable, financial markets and the political processes will come along to end it. But the final note to leave you on, Bob, a philosophical note, and that is, are we at a state that our founding fathers could never have contemplated, where we can't solve, or that D.K. Wheeler never could have contemplated, that we can't solve our problems short of a crisis? We have to get into a crisis to solve our problems. We'll solve these problems in a crisis. America is resilient, our political system works, and when we get a crisis, we'll come together and solve it. But do we have to have a crisis to solve it? Final question. All right, look forward to your questions. Thank you, Bob. We'll just share this.
Okay, any questions, comments, and screams of anguish? Way in the back.
Thank you very much for coming and talking tonight. Thank you very much for coming and talking tonight. If the current course of fiscal responsibility continues, how many years are we from bankruptcy?
Oh, I think 10 years out, if actions in the interim haven't been taken, we're going to be in it. Financial markets won't tolerate it. We've already had two. S&P has twice now said it downgraded the United States from debt. We'll get downgraded further, and we'll find ourselves unable to sell the treasuries. The way the government works, of course, is we don't have enough money to pay our bills, so we borrow. And that's what the issues of new treasuries are, to pay for current expenditures of the federal government. And you can go on for a while, because America's a big, strong, rich country. But even the strongest and richest country in the world can go beyond its own ability to pay its bills. And when you get there, who's going to lend to you? That's the discipline that will eventually come to play here. Government is not like a household. Typical household, you got revenue coming in, you got expenditures. If those expenditures exceed your income, at some point you can go to your relatives. If you got friendly relatives, you can go to the banks for a while, but at some point you're going to get closed down, and you're going to have to change your lifestyle. Now, governments can go on a long time, but they can't go on forever, because the borrowers are out there. Governments are now becoming dependent on the financial markets. And I'd say within the next 10 years or so, the dangerous thing about this good period we're in now is that it's taken away the urgency. It's taken away the urgency because the deficit's coming down, and people say, isn't this nice? Isn't this a happy state of affairs? Aren't we fortunate? Look, we have a deficit that's lower than the historic average of the deficit as a fraction of GDP. Yeah, it is, and it will be. CBO's got this laid out, but then, boom, then it really skyrockets. And when it skyrockets, we're going to have to issue, huge amounts of treasury debt. And that's when the market is going to say, nope, we're not going to give you that debt. The Chinese are going to say, we're not going to continue funding you. The Japanese will say that. They fund half of our new treasury issues. So I think it's not that far off. But Bob, you should comment on this. You've been in political life. Maybe we should get you commenting on this, Riley. Business people like myself are often criticized for being short-sighted. But business people make investments for the future, and they have to look at what the return on that investment will be. They use something called discounting. You discount back. We get our money back over the 20-year life of this investment. And they apply a reasonable discount rate to the future. My experience in the political sphere, and this is not a comment on either party, is that politicians tend to use very high discount rates. The future is never here. What's here is my next election. What's always confronting me is that election, which, if you're a House member, on average is a year away. So you discount 4 years out. You discount 6 years out. That's not relevant. So somehow we've got to get politicians thinking, applying a different discount rate. And then I'm back to what I said earlier. Maybe the fault lies not with the stars, but with us, because we're discounting the future too much as well. When we ask the Congress and our elected officials to give us all these benefits, and never asking them, well, that's wonderful to have this or that in my district. What's it going to cost, Congressman? And how am I going to end up paying for it? That's not a discussion that happens in many open town hall meetings. Other? Yeah.
Okay, 1 second, Frankie. Is we given the word? making things understandable and very complicated, and I appreciate that. Let me throw a different set of proposals at you and see what your thoughts are. One is defense spending has doubled in the last 11 years, so let's cut that back in half. The NSA alone and intelligence expenditures are about $75 billion. Take Social Security off budget again, we're self-funding till 2010. And let's put some constraints on healthcare costs, just for starters. We have to make adjustments for the demographics, I understand that. Raising the ceiling on income that's earned and taxable under Social Security would change that dramatically, just a small percentage. So what are your thoughts on some of those ideas?
They're good ideas, and they've got to be explored. But the one that really is powerful is slowing the rate of growth of healthcare costs. I mean, that's really the game. There was a brilliant character in the Treasury Department when I was there who was Undersecretary of Domestic Markets, responsible for the U.S. bond issuance. And he said one day to me, it struck home. He said, because we have all these United States government, guarantees Social Security, guarantees Medicare, all these, which means it's an insurance program. Where the United States government is in the business of guaranteeing these promises that we've made to the political people. And this is a comment on your military. He said, if you were to look at the United States government as an analyst would, what would you conclude? You would conclude we are a gigantic insurance company with a small defense subsidiary. Defense is big in absolute numbers, but in relative terms, it's reasonably small. As he said, it would be, if you looked at the United States government as a business analyst, you would have said, what's it all about? It's an insurance company with a small defense subsidiary. It'd be nice to find another $100 billion, but never my number, 70 trillion. That's and if you watch the dialogue in Washington today, who's talking about the 70 trillion? Who's talking about the unfunded commitments of the future, the promises to the future that we can't afford? So I'd be all with you, that helps in the short term. But unless we get at these long-term problems, we're going to face the issue I went over with you of not being able to fund our government, of defaults on the U.S. Treasury issues. Nobody will buy them. Or if they buy them, they'll buy them at interest rates like we used to have of 15, 20%. And then you really are in the soup. You really are in the soup. So I would applaud Congress taking a look at those ideas of yours. They're good ideas. And they'll help us in the interim. But we're not too far away from that time when this cataclysm hits us. And I wish we get on with the actions to deal with the really big issues. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, veterans benefits are in there as a part of that. Because these things keep just growing and growing and growing. And the gap between income, revenue coming in, and expenditures keeps rising. So good ideas help in the short term, but aren't enough to deal with the long-term problems of Social Security. That's the aging issue. That's just have people retire a little bit later, or means test some of the payments and so on. Healthcare costs. How do you get healthcare costs down? I mean, that is the big issue. I think we made a big mistake back in BK's day, Roosevelt's day, of putting wage controls during the war on unemployment. The National Wage Control Plan was put into effect. And the employers competing for the workers obliged the federal requirement, but they skirted around it by beginning to provide benefits on the side. And one of those benefits was health care. Little did they realize the consequences of making third parties responsible for your health care. Because it disconnected the consumer and the cost from the provider. And what I'd like to see us do is break that connection so that we aren't so dependent on third-party payers. Now that's big because that's the way the system is organized. But there are ways to end that connection. But just ask yourself, how does healthcare get provided in America? For most of it, somebody else pays for it. How often have you gone to your provider, your healthcare provider, and said, "Doctor, do I really need this? Is there a less expensive way to deal with this problem? I'd like to shop around. Can you recommend some other doctors that I ought to talk to who might be able to give me a more cost-effective solution to this?" I remember one day I was doing one of these talk shows, and some prominent member of the Fourth Estate was doing the questioning. And I was making this sort of argument. I said, Americans are great consumers, but we aren't very good consumers of healthcare, the way healthcare is organized. And when you buy an automobile, you get wreck insurance, you get casualty insurance. So if you have a big accident, you're covered. But do you get insurance for your windshield wipers? I mean, do you get coverage for everything? No, you don't. But the way healthcare has been provided, it's soup to nuts, it's everything. So what I think we ought to be going to is a system where people have healthcare coverage for catastrophic type things. This case where the high deductible, and you pay more of your own healthcare costs, and you then take a deeper interest in the quality of the healthcare you're getting and the cost of it. Very few people ever see the real cost of the healthcare they're getting. I had a great friend who went and got a hip operation. And he told me that he was covered under Medicare at $17,000. And I happened about the same time to be talking to Newt Gingrich. And Gingrich then was in full flower. He was on Time magazine as the prime minister, and I knew him quite well. And he really loved the healthcare issues. And he was telling me about his agenda for America and how he was going to delegate this to this member of Congress and this to this member of Congress, but he was going to keep healthcare. And that he had the answer on healthcare. And I said, "Newt, really? You got the answer on healthcare? What is it?" He said, "It's the private sector." I said, "Well, I'm for the private sector." "How are you going to do it?" He said, "I'm going to unleash the creativity of the private sector. That'll solve it. The innovative efforts of the private sector will bring down costs and improve service." And I said, "Well, I think it probably would. But let me tell you about my friend who just had this hip operation. And Medicare paid for it, and they paid for $17,000. Do you think that the private sector is so efficient that they can get the cost of his hip operation down to zero?" He said, "What do you mean?" And I said, if the government is making healthcare available, subsidizing healthcare to the extent they are, the private sector can't compete against government subsidies. I mean, this is the tough one. And another piece of this one is that one of the reasons healthcare costs are rising so much is technology. And we are producing the best healthcare technologies in the world in the United States. But they're bloody costly. They are really costly. And every hospital worth its name wants them. So the costs of providing healthcare are going up and up and up and up. And putting some brake on all of this, I wish I thought Obamacare would do it, but I'm not all that optimistic that it will. But some brake on the continuing escalation of healthcare costs seems to me has to be part of our national agenda for the next 20 years. But I like your ideas. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I just have one question. Again, thank you for coming this evening. I appreciate your efforts to be here. But my question is this, that do you think, this is a general question, but do you think in like the current debt negotiations that the concerns about the health care, Obamacare, have any business in those negotiations?
Well, they're coming up right now, of course, in the government shutdown. That's what that's all about. The Republicans are saying we don't like Obamacare, and we're going to use the budget as a vehicle to one way or another. What they'd like to do is defund it. They've lost that many, many times. So they're saying postpone it for a year. They're not getting very far with that. And they might be right in principle. I could see where in principle you could agree with them. But I think tactically, and I've had this discussion with some of the Republican leaders, tactically it's a mistake because they're going to lose. And the American public doesn't like the idea of putting the government's operations at risk on this issue. I think their view is fight that out. If it's as bad as you say it is, let it come into being and it will collapse of its own weight. So I think it's a bad tactic. On the other hand, I talked about these unfunded mandates that are bankrupting the country. This is an unfunded mandate. This is a huge unfunded mandate. So you can see why these Republicans are saying we shouldn't have another unfunded mandate. At least we're addressing the big issues of the budget. But in my view, they're addressing them the wrong way. I was asked today to do some of these talk shows over the weekend, and believe me, somebody's going to say to me, your question, do you agree with the Tea Party's view on health care? And Mr. Secretary, what would you do if you were back in the Treasury? And so on and so forth. And what's going to happen with the debt ceiling? Will that get resolved? And if you were back there, what would you be telling the president? So this is a good warm-up. Thanks.
I appreciate your honesty and straightforwardness in your talk. And you ended on a bit of an optimistic note, saying that, that things will get solved, and it makes the crisis seem a bit like a short-term thing.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we haven't passed a real budget since I can't remember. We've had multiple debt ceiling crises, which even as you explained, if we can't spend, we borrow. It hasn't been that simple lately, unfortunately. How do you think we can solve this if nobody's really talking about it at all? And you mentioned that Congress can have to every couple of years or 6 years they have to be up for election and report to their electorate. And you mentioned gerrymandering, and maybe something comes that up. Also, the effect of money in politics has really been gunking it up a lot lately and kind of screwing up elections. And I was going to ask you to comment on that.
Well, I don't think anybody can tell you how this is going to get resolved, because people are really at loggerheads. I think it was only yesterday that the president called the speaker and began a dialogue with him. My sense of how it gets resolved is the issue of the annual budget, the issue of shutting down the government for lack of a budget, will be rolled into the issue of the ceiling. Now, the ceiling, we can survive for 2 weeks without funding the federal government. The shutdown, 2-week shutdown, non-essential services. It's not something we want, it's not pretty, it's not good, but we can survive. We really can't survive the inability to pay our debts, to pay our obligations. And therefore, the debt ceiling just has to be raised, or we forfeit the greatest advantage America has, which is the full faith and credit that our debt is given in global markets. We are the gold standard for debt markets. And if we ever forfeited that, treasuries would lose their pristine position in the world. Our role as the financial powerhouse of the world would be called into question. Our ability to provide global leadership would be called into question. A default's unthinkable. And whereas with the shutdown, I think the Democrats are getting a victory because the Republicans are being predominantly blamed. With a default, where America can't pay its interest on its debts, I think the president will get the blame. Because after all, it's the president and the Treasury that are responsible for the fiscal affairs of the United States. The blame will come back to the president on that. I'm sure the White House advisors will be going to the president at some point here soon, and it's not very far, I think it's October the 17th, saying to him, Mr. President, you know, we better find a way to solve this, or it's going to be our tar baby. And if we go beyond the 17th, if we go much beyond the 17th, I mean, there's going to be chaos in world markets.
Right there.
Yeah, you think he does. Yeah, he can't raise it on his. I mean, there's some artificial things he can do, but he can't really raise it. I've been there and tried to think about what you can do when you're in this situation. At some point, you run out of options, and they're at the point. Secretary Little announced that he's out of options beyond the 17th of October.
Hi. During your term as U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, what would you say is your biggest contribution? And also, secondly, what was the best part of your job? Good questions. Well, I think probably the things that I'm most pleased with, I was pleased to be part of that effort to lower marginal tax rates on capital. I've always believed that lower tax rates. This was when I came in. The tax rates on dividends were at the highest level were 36.9%, and the capital gains rates, gains on stock, was at I think it was 25%. We were able to bring the dividend rates down and to 15%, and the capital gains rates down 15%. That was helpful at a time when the economy was weak. And I'd like to find a way that we could make permanent low taxes on capital. Now, why is that? Well, you create your future. You create your economic future by current investments. And people will invest more if they have lower tax rates. For the simple reason that returns on capital invested are higher with low tax rates. So low tax rates are a way to encourage capital formation. And capital formation is the seed corn of the future output. And as you have more capital, labor productivity goes up. And as labor productivity goes up, there's the potential for higher per capita income, higher wages, which is what we all want to see happen. So I'm pleased with that. I was pleased to continue to push for more open trade agreements, and we accomplished some. I was pleased to establish the first finance department in the world that had an intelligence capacity to deal with terrorism, terrorist finance. We rightly recognized that if you're going to deal with the terrorists, one way to do it is to follow the money. Because they need the money, they need the blood money in order to function. And we put in place, with the authorization of Congress, went up and persuaded them that the Treasury Department needed its own intelligence capacity and regulatory authority over the banks to, that know their customers and report in on suspicious activities. Can't talk about it because it's all classified, but many lives were saved because of that. Because when you watch the money, you can go find the terrorists. And when you watch the money, you can go to the terrorist funding bases and take action against them. So that was important. The other one was fun. My first meeting of the G7. G7 is the 7 big countries of the world. Went to it as a rookie finance minister and was sort of taken aback by these discussions. We were talking about global trade, we were talking about global imbalances, we were talking about global capital formations. And I left the meeting, something was ajar, I couldn't quite figure out what it was, and then it dawned on me. We didn't have the right people in the meeting. Because if you want to talk about global trade, you better get China and Brazil and India in the room. And if you want to talk about global imbalances, you've got to have China in there. They had this huge current account surplus, which was the other side of our huge current account deficit. So I came back, talked to the staff at the Treasury, and it turned out that the next meeting of the G7, America was the chairman, so I was the chairman of the meeting. And I sent out an invitation to the Chinese, the Russian, the Indian, the Brazilian, and the South African finance ministers to attend the meeting. Never happened before. And now it's become a permanent part of the meetings of the G7. So that's something that I think I'm real pleased with. Disappointments, I wish we'd done better on the deficits.
We got time for 2 more. Way back in the back.
I think I'll be fine with that one. I have a question. Thank you for showing up here and speaking to us. First of all, in the term that you served as Treasury Secretary, it's a 4-part question. How many times did you raise the ceiling? First question. Second part is, did you agree with your predecessors' policies with regards to TARP? Third being, do you agree with the Fed chairman now policies and possibly the predecessors' policies, which seems to be about the same, and whether or not...
That's a great question. I think the answer is I'm not sure.
And then,
Let me try and answer. I got
okay, so whether or not, and I know that you're talking about the financial markets coming in,
right.
and possibly dealing with some stuff like that. If right now what is reflected in Walmart, on Wall Street is non-fundamental trading, because right now, in all intents and purposes, we get GDP of like what, 1 or 2%. Why is the stock market still going up? And so you're, saying that the world financial markets are going to come in and they're going to buy our bonds based on those fundamentals, but our stock market right now isn't responding to fundamentals. So that's my question.
Okay. Well, on Bernanke and QE, you're asking really about QE2. QE2 was an effort to use monetary policy to get more growth in the American economy. Okay. The idea was that lower interest, if you give lower interest rates to Treasury holders, they'll sell out, and then they'll go in and buy something else. So they'll move capital around, create more liquidity in the system. It hasn't worked out just the way Ben Bernanke and the Fed wanted, because while we've seen asset values go up, as you say, the real economy hasn't responded nearly as well. And we still have unacceptably high unemployment rates. We still have stagnant wages. We still have the middle class problem of a middle class that seems to be shrinking. And we don't have very strong GDP growth. On the other hand, where would we have been if we didn't do QE2, QE3? And the dilemma that Ben Bernanke has, who's a good friend, he and I served in the administration together. He was over the Council of Economic Advisors. The problem is, how do you get off this QE3? Because when he announced he was going to taper, which means just not get out of it, not stop it, but move from maybe 85 billion a month to 83 or 80 or something, of buying of these mortgage-backed securities and of the treasuries. What happened? Well, the market shot out from under it. You know, it just and Ben is a believer in transparency. Big debate among monetary economists. Should you be transparent or not? Greenspan never liked transparency. If you're transparent, you lose some power. The markets know what you're going to do. And what Ben found out, as soon as he announced the tapering, what happened? There wasn't a gradual taper. The market just shot down. It went to where he said he wanted to take it. Right away. Instantly. So, I'm sympathetic with what he did. I think he's been a good chairman. You asked about TARP. I was never a big fan of TARP. On the other hand, they had to do something back then in 2008. We were really over the edge. We were looking right into the chasm. And we wouldn't have had, no bank would have been standing. Not Goldman Sachs, not JP Morgan, nobody was how bad it was. And if all your banks collapse, you can't have an economy that functions. And the runs on the banks would have been extraordinary, and we would have been back in 1933 or something. So I think they had to do it. There were mistakes in the way it was done that, you know, that created unnecessary uncertainty in the market by one day propping up somebody and the next day letting somebody else go, the Lehman versus Bear Stearns situation. On the other hand, overall, they had to do what they did.
Why is the stock market?
The stock market has a rhythm of its own that I've never understood. Hey, Candy.
John, is it my understanding that if we raise the retirement age to 70, which we're all right around there right now, both of us are perfectly healthy, would that solve, so then Medicare would kick in until we were 70, would that solve the problem?
It would go a long way on Social Security. Yeah, it would go a long way. But you can't do it right away because so many people, you got to give people that time to plan their retirement. That's why I said 6 months, you know, every decade. Eventually we should get, I think, to 70. I mean, people are living so much longer. Yeah, you're still pretty healthy, and you look terrific. So that's great. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I wonder if I could ask you to tie together 3 things that you've mentioned. The 10 years on, what is the effect on the deficit of the tax policies that you helped bring in? And 10 years on, what is the effect on the middle class that you mentioned, middle class? What is the 10 years on, what is the effect on those 2 things, of that tax policy?
Of the tax policy?
And that is the last question.
Well, I think you can look it up in CBO, get their view of it. CBO, I think, calculates the ongoing costs of the Bush tax cuts. It's something like both the 01 and 03 tax cuts. I wasn't there 01. It's something like $1.2 trillion over a 10-year period. The effects on the middle class, hard to say exactly, but I've got to believe that the middle class benefited, at least during that period of time when I was there, because there's something like 6 or 7 million jobs created over a short period of time. And GDP began to grow at a very good clip. And when GDP is growing and jobs are being created, it's the middle class that benefits. Now,
stagnant wages and middle class, the shrinking middle class, and the absence of opportunities for folks who don't get the great benefit of going to MSU or some other fine university. Because there's a real separation occurring in America between the fortunate and the less fortunate. And it's striking. I saw a graph recently that shows from 1975 on what's happened to per capita productivity, which we normally think of as the driver of wages, right? That's classical economic theory, is that as productivity goes up, wages go up. But what we found is that wages haven't been going up, and that compensation, it's understandable why wages aren't going up, because employers are paying more in healthcare benefits and non-wage benefits. But then you ask the question, what's happened to total compensation? And total compensation itself is flat. So something is going on. Now what is that? I puzzle over it. I think what's going on is that, and that's at the same time that people in the most fortunate, the elite workers, call them the elite workers, whether they're baseball players or movie stars or lawyers or whatnot, business executives, are finding their compensation go way up. The average is not. Now why? What could be going on? I think what's going on is that with the fall of the wall, with China entering the capitalist market system, with Brazil opening up, with India opening up, what we found is there's something like 6 billion new workers in the global economy. And you say, well, they don't compete against us. Well, they absolutely do, because the products we produce here can be produced over there. And if they can be produced over there with wage rates that are much lower than ours, those wage rates will affect what happens in the United States. And our firms will move their workers out. They'll move their work out, and so on. We're in a whole new world than we were in 1975 because of the geopolitical changes and the fact that China, and India, and Brazil, and Malaysia, and Indonesia, and Vietnam are now part of the global economy, and those workers are affecting wage rates here. Recently, a good development has occurred, and Montana is part of it. It's the emerging shale gas, shale oil opportunities, which are making America, America now produces more energy than the Soviet Union, or than Russia. And we're finding that our energy costs here are much lower than the rest of the world. Well, what's happening as a result of that is that those firms that took their workers over to Indonesia or Malaysia or Vietnam or Cambodia are now bringing them back here, because our energy advantage is so large. The bad thing about it is the workers that left, those jobs that left the United States 20 years ago at $80,000 a year or $70,000 a year or $60,000 are coming back at $35,000. That's what's happening. Now, the only answer I can see, since productivity alone won't solve this problem, and education alone probably won't solve it, although education, the one thing we do know is that people who are educated have higher compensation, have higher income. So get a college degree, get some education, get well trained in something, and your prospects are going to be much better than otherwise. But the other lesson of all this is that we may not be able to rely for a high standard of living on wages alone. So think about investing in equity markets or investing in something that will grow, because it looks like there's very significant downward pressure on wages, holding wage rates in check. Good, thank you.